Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd like to welcome you to Monmouth School and HMSG's referendum debate. Your opening proposition speaker for today is going to be Bethany Handley. She's a student at HMSG. Next, you'll hear from Lewis, who's the leading opposition speaker. Mr. Gareth Dunn is a physics teacher at Monmouth School. Mr. Dunn also stood for Monmouth's UKIP candidate in 2015. Dr. James Harrison is the next speaker. Dr. Harrison is head of history at Monmouth School. Chris Briant is, of course, the shadow leader of the House of Commons. Mark Reckless is our final speaker. Recently elected AM and, of course, ex-Tory MP turned to UKIP. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to your proposition speaker, Miss Bethany Handley.
This House is proposing the motion that the British people should vote to remain in the European Union in June. Brexit. This has become an everyday familiar term, a comfortable euphemism that many people find appealing due to a host of charismatic celebrity leaders, a call to patriotism, and a nostalgic quest for a lost empire. This Brexit jingoism has become a convenient euphemism that masks the reality and the complexity of the debate. Political language, said Orwell, is designed to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. Unfortunately, Orwell's thoughts are far too applicable to the Brexit euphemism. I will scrutinise the Brexit euphemism in the areas of the democracy, sovereignty, the economy, immigration and security. Is our democracy being weakened by our membership of the EU? A perfect democracy has never existed, even in the Greek state that invented it. The UK's is far from perfect. However, the EU has aimed to create a more constructive forum based on consensual decision-making. At present, we are integral in forging the legislation that is passed in the European Union. 90% of the time, we are on the winning side of the legislation that is passed. This EU democracy has had a positive impact on every individual within this room, especially in the areas of the environment, such as cleaner beaches and rivers, and employment rights. Are we losing our sovereignty? Are we in danger of being sucked into a federalised Europe? Firstly, what is the point of absolute sovereignty if we sacrifice Scotland? A situation that is a plausible reality if we leave the EU. Secondly, David Cameron has ensured that we cannot be drawn into federalism. Could our economy grow uninhibited if we leave the constraints of the European Union? Currently, transnational corporations utilise us as a gateway to Europe. Why would they sacrifice a market of 500 million consumers in order to trade with a singular nation? Brexit could throw us into an economic stagnation from which we may never recover. Are we being overwhelmed by immigrants? Immigrants such as my aunt, who is leading the way in the development of cancer treatment. Our borders are already outside of the Schengen area of free movement, so we have control of our borders. The current reality is that we are attracting a large number of well-qualified people who diversify our workforce and provide much-needed skills in education, construction, and medicine. Our economy is making a net profit from immigration. Would the UK be more secure outside of the EU? At the moment, we benefit from the European Common Security and Defence Policy combined with Europol. We are stronger in a partnership that shares resources and intelligence. In addition, we must not overlook the two largest threats that we all face right now: Putin's anarchic Russia and the barbaric ISIS. Leaving the EU would weaken our shared security. If we leave the EU, we would be in danger of increasing inequality, individualism, civic distrust, and xenophobia. A situation that would be amplified by the spurious leaders of the Leave campaign. Brexit would be political arson. I am proud to be a European citizen. The ideals that the EU are built upon are truly inspiring. It has encouraged peace, prosperity, education, and environmental protection. The EU is not perfect, but truly what is. On balance, we are far stronger in the EU, wielding the pragmatic power to influence our futures for the good of all. Euphemisms are dangerous. I hope I have helped you to see past the Brexit euphemism, as future generations should look back on the 23rd of June and be proud to call us Great Britain, not Little Britain. Thank you.
David Hume once wrote that a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. Too much of our debate about EU membership has been shrouded in empty verbiage and scaremongering. But our challenge, ladies and gentlemen, is to move beyond this, to take a mature approach based on the role of government. I will put before you today these three fundamental tests of good government. 1, security. 2, prosperity. And thirdly, a pursuit of the reality, not the utopian. And ladies and gentlemen, I put it to you that this EU fails all three of these criteria. Thomas Hobbes argued that the principal purpose of government was to protect people, property, and to prevent social fracture. But does our EU membership contribute to this? Let me make it clear. Our external security and internal order does not depend in any significant way on the EU. If anything, ladies and gentlemen, it is eroded by the EU's rampant ideologies. Our security depends on NATO, on our intelligence agreements with the USA, on our superb police and on our unrivaled military. It is these bodies, ladies and gentlemen, not the continental Sir Humphreys in Brussels, that substantiate the words of John Donne and allow our defences to lie on the Elbe and the Danube. But does the EU augment this in some way? The short answer, ladies and gentlemen, well, it's a resounding no. A naive pursuit of privacy and a blatant Gaullist anti-Americanism block the sharing of essential data and the expulsion of terrorists. Attempts to alleviate the dystopia of Syria have exposed us to yet more threats of terror. EU membership fails Hobbes' test. But perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, perhaps we ought to have a more optimistic view of human nature. Let us turn to the ideas of John Locke, who argued for a more reciprocal social contract, that government has a duty to secure life, liberty, and provide the basis for prosperity. This is my second test. Does the EU promote our prosperity? It's undeniable that in the past, the EU has performed this role. In 1973, we needed to catch up. We needed competition from EU companies in such areas as varied as cars and specialist leather products. This was an electric shock to a frankly moribund system. This, ladies and gentlemen, this was the past. Let us now look to the future. Europe's economy is failing. It is being killed by statism, protectionism, and ideology. Outside of Germany, things are truly dire. Britain, in contrast, is more characterised by growth, by jobs, by outward-looking industry. Only Germany can truly compete. Will this be lost if we leave the EU? No. Our trade with the EU is declining, down to 45% from 55% in recent years. Much trade now is between companies in the same group or supply chain. Thus, minor changes in cost will not dramatically affect this. Concerns about a trade deal are also heavily overstated. WTO rules will apply. Average tariffs of 1 to 2% across the globe will have little impact in a world of internet-connected supply chains and fluctuating exchange rates. A punitive settlement? How likely is this, ladies and gentlemen? Europe is falling apart politically. unstable, weak and powerless entities need all the friends they can get. Europe no longer provides prosperity. Decline, the euro crisis, banking crises across southern Europe, unemployment, nationalism, the cancer of fascism once again rising its ugly head. This is not dynamism, nor is it stability, ladies and gentlemen. Our future lies elsewhere. To finish, I'd like to leave you with the views of Edmund Burke. Commenting on the revolution in France, Burke noted the damage to safety, to security, to prosperity when insipid institutions pursued utopian abstractions in the face of evident, harsher realities. Generations of European politicians have zealously pursued the federalist ideal. To begin with, this did serve a more noble purpose in the consequences of a truly cataclysmic conflict. Yet today, that federalist dream still reigns supreme on the halls of the European Parliament, on the floors of the Commission, on the lips of every member of the Franco-German political establishment. It has become indelibly perverted, siring institutions driven by a toxic mélange of statism, protectionism and romanticism. This EU, ladies and gentlemen, this liberal vanity project, this unequal partnership of nations has sown the seeds of its own destruction. Now, ladies and gentlemen, now is the time to move on, lest we wish to accept a Burkean fate as the victim of this polity without legitimacy, this polity without prosperity, this polity without purpose. Thank you.
Chairman, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen, and Howell Rose, who I'll happily play at tennis once he's finished his exams. 2 months ago came some beautiful, if sobering, news. Ratko Mladic was convicted of crimes against humanity by the United Nations War Crimes Tribunal. Mladic is a Serbian nationalist warlord who had given the orders for the cold-blooded murder of 7,000 men and boys in Srebrenica in 1995. The truth about this massacre reached the Western media over the following 2 weeks. I distinctly remember the days that the news trickled through quite slowly. It hit home particularly hard because I had been travelling through this region a short time previously. On returning to England, I see these places again in flames. I see the international community weak and helpless, and there was nothing more disheartening and more disillusioning than watching Bosnia burn with the West utterly impotent and standing on the sidelines. The way the war ended in 1995 was therefore relatively encouraging. The international community do step in. The Bosnian Serbs are defeated, a peace deal is signed. Serbia becomes a stable democratic country, and 2 months ago, the butcher Mladic is finally sentenced to what he deserves: public humiliation, disgrace, and a lingering death of old age in a Dutch prison cell. And here is the history lesson. The EU has been instrumental in helping create this stability in the Balkans through soft power. It's true that it was NATO that stopped the fighting. It's true, arguably, that the EU provoked the war in the first place by rushing in and recognising the independence of Croatia prematurely. But in the long term, for peace to last, for Mladic to be handed over for trial, for the ghosts to begin to be laid to rest, for hope to return to these areas, you need the soft power of the EU. Now, soft power is an oxymoron, but it works. It is an inordinately important part of geopolitics and international relations. It's the winning over, the attraction to your side or point of view by offering your opponent what they envy. In Bosnia and Serbia, it worked like this. Peace had been achieved in 1999 through NATO's guns and bombs. But NATO can't force a population to accept your ideas or to permanently accept your peace deal. NATO can't force you to get rid of your dictator, but the EU can, and the EU did. Serbia was only allowed to join the EU when it handed over its war criminals. when it engaged in peace and reconciliation, when it ensures that the peace agreements are embedded, and when the populist nationalism that sparked the whole crisis in the first place is no longer dominating the airwaves and the classrooms. The timings of the handing over the war criminals and the accession of Serbia to the EU membership process were utterly choreographed. Now, the EU thankfully has no army. The EU thankfully has no decent hard power whatsoever. But the EU does have considerable reserves of soft power, and this has been instrumental in stabilising Europe over the past 30 years. What the EU achieved quite dramatically in Serbia and Bosnia, they are also achieving on a small scale throughout Eastern Europe. Now, where the most important battle for democratic sovereignty is taking place, and has mostly been won, is in Eastern Europe. I don't care too much about minor losses of sovereignty to Westminster, or to Cardiff, or to Brussels. I don't really mind if we get Assembly members for Cardiff foisted on us by party lists, even if no one has directly elected for them. I don't really mind if we have PR or not. Now, these issues make a Lib Dem or UKIP politician go purple with anger. But I care that Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, the Baltic and Balkan states stay moderately democratic and liberal over the next 20 years. And I do know which of these two issues will make a greater difference to the quality of life of our students and young people in Monmouth in the next few decades. The most powerful force keeping Europe stable and at peace today is not NATO's nuclear umbrella, it's the rather more mundane desire of many East Europeans to live like a German, or a Welshman, or even a Welsh woman. It's the uniquely powerful combination of NATO hard power and EU soft power that has achieved a peaceful transition in the aftermath of the Cold War in Central European zone of small, vulnerable countries. And it's this zone, this geopolitical Achilles heel of Europe, that has been the cause of 3 major conflicts in the 20th century. So I am not an unalloyed enthusiast of all things to do with the EU. I am very sceptical about the federalist process. It needs watching, and Britain, in the past 69 years, has watched it quite carefully. With sufficient care, most measures we don't like can be blocked. I don't like the corruption and the waste of this system. And yet, none of this comes close to persuading me that it's worth sacrificing what I am most optimistic, impressed and hopeful about. And that is the clear stabilising and moderating role played by the EU over the past 60 years to make the continent of Europe a safer, better, well-governed, wealthier and pleasanter place to live. The opportunities available to us in this zone of relative prosperity and harmony are not to be taken lightly. So it's very important that Britain continues to take a lead in this, to pay the small costs of internationalism, and to avoid the traps of nationalism, cheap populism and isolationism. Our example and our lead count. So in June, as someone said, don't ask what Europe can do for you, ask what you can do for Europe.
Hi. Good speech. Us Brexiters have had a rough time recently. The bulk of the political class, the church, some big business, and even the President of the USA have weighed in to lecture us on the dangers of leaving the EU. And what dangers? House prices will plummet, trade will falter, GDP will drop by £3,000 per household per annum. Our global influence will be diminished. Our streets a haven for terrorists. And this week it was announced by our PM, no less, that as stable and united and prosperous as the EU is, its members will start to slaughter each other as soon as we leave. Our own esteemed chaplain used his pulpit to inform us that his Remain vote was guided by Christian moral principles, and in the service last week treated us to a film which proclaimed that without the guiding paternal hand of the EU, such things as a fair trial, protection from slavery, and the right to privacy would be beyond us, that domestic violence would be inadequately dealt with, and that peace in Northern Ireland would still be nothing more than an aspiration. All our firstborn will die, crops will fail, Fire will rain from the heavens. And Satan will establish his kingdom on earth from a Brexit campaign bus parked in London. Okay, I made that bit up.
All of it.
It's parked in Birmingham. Now, as entertaining as it would be to debate this apocalyptic, preposterous and deeply pessimistic scaremongering, I'm not going to. In fact, I think it is a mistake to be drawn into any debate about the pros and cons of the EU, because such debates tend to miss the real issue. And I'll try and explain what I mean with a simple analogy about the Commission and its relation to the people of Europe. Imagine two prisoners who share a cell, arguing over the colour of the walls. One prisoner likes the colour, the other hates it and would rather it was changed. They bicker day after day, each prisoner presenting what they think are cogent and well thought out reasons as to why they are correct and the other is wrong. But regardless of who comes out on top, what should not be lost on either prisoner, especially the one who likes the colour, is that it is the warden who chooses the colour of the walls. It is the warden who decides, not them, and their acquiescence, their approval of the colour, even if it is offered freely, is neither sought nor required. The opinion of the prisoner who likes the colour is as valueless to the warden as that of any other prisoner. And the same could be said about any other aspect of the prison. Some prisoners might like the orange jumpsuits. Some might like the exercise regime, the meals in the canteen, or the fragrance of the soap in the prison showers. But in all cases, it is the warden who arranges and decides those things, and the approval of the prisoners is neither sought nor required. And the prisoners who do approve of the prison, who like the meals or the clothes or the soap, even those willing to turn a blind eye to the fact that the warden is corrupt and hasn't had the prison's books signed off for 2 decades, should not proceed under the delusion that their appreciation or approval of what the warden is doing is somehow gives them a voice or makes their opinions more relevant than those prisoners who disapprove. In all cases, any sense of freedom, any notion of togetherness or common purpose with the warden is false. The approval of the prisoners, whether it's offered or not, is neither sought nor required. So those of you in the audience who are tempted to vote Remain, perhaps because you see it as a progressive or moral vote, perhaps or because you favour open borders and mass immigration, or the EU environmental rules, or the trade rules, or the common agricultural policy, or the EU's overtures to Turkey, or even because the party you vote for says you should do so on the understanding that you are simply admiring the colour of the walls of your cell. The warden decides, not you. He is not subject to your vote. He does not seek your approval, even if you are generous enough to offer it, and he certainly doesn't need it because he will be in charge, unelected and remote, for your entire life sentence. Or will he? The warden has thrown open the prison gates in a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and he has said that if more than half of the prisoners decide to go free, they can all go. About half the prison can't wait to get going and are already packing their bags. The other half, fearful and institutionalised, whisper caution. As has already been mentioned, everything from divine disapproval to World War III and the end of life as we know it has been predicted. To leave and to make your own way in the world is parodied as a leap in the dark. Now, if us Brexiters are going to be lectured on the morality in this debate, let us look at the morality of that argument. Voting on the basis of fear or pessimism to limit your freedoms, to lock yourself into a system of government immune to the opinions of the people it leads, not only removes your voice, but if a majority of you wish it, you remove the voice of your fellow citizens too, and their children, your children, and the generations yet to come. What right has anybody to condemn others to live under such a system? What right have you to remove the freedoms of your fellow citizens simply because you approve of the terms under which those freedoms are removed? If enough prisoners vote to stay, all are condemned. And they will not be voting for the status quo either. The prison evolves. The warden currently allows the prisoners their small freedoms. They can choose their brand of toothpaste, have posters on their cell walls, even wear tartan slippers before bedtime. But the warden reserves the right to encroach upon those freedoms too, if he so wishes at any stage in the future, because it is in his contract and he is in charge, not the prisoners. Ladies and gentlemen, freedom, cooperation and trade do not depend on EU membership, as the 180 or so other countries not in the EU will testify. But this vote in June is not really about all that. It's about you. It's about you having the ability to change your minds, to seek change through the ballot box as you proceed through life. I'll cut short. Ladies and gentlemen, free yourselves. And let me be free alongside you. That's all I ask. Freedom is not a leap in the dark. It is a walk into the light. The American president urges us to barter away our liberties while jealously guarding those of his nation. Let us reject his self-serving hypocrisy and vote to leave our cells on the 23rd of June and walk into the light. And together, quote the most moral of American sons, Martin Luther King, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Thank you.
Well, I'm slightly worried about the audience because I note that the slaughter of the firstborn just got a big round of applause. So I'm not sure where this is going. I was cited earlier as saying that the EU is one of the most successful organisations, historical organisations in history. Let me explain why I say that. A few years ago, I think you're still allowed to mention Tony Blair in Britain. Tony Blair had just been elected Prime Minister. He was invited to go and speak at the Assemblée Nationale in Paris. And he'd done a couple of weeks working in a bar in his gap year or something or other, so he thought that he spoke perfect French. He decided he would go to Paris and do his speech in French. And all the Foreign Office people prepared him for a few weeks in advance. They drafted a speech for him. He read it out. It went extremely well. All the French newspapers said that he was the best British Prime Minister ever. They don't say that now, admittedly, but they said that then. And he got a bit overexcited and he said, next time I come, I'll do the press conference in French. Now, press conference is much more difficult. You don't pre-prepare everything you say. You have to listen to the question in French without simultaneous translation and reply in French without Alistair Campbell or somebody else telling you what to say. So it's much more difficult. The first question came up and he was asked, Mr. Blair, what do you think of Lionel Jospin, who was then the socialist French Prime Minister, and there were meant to be big rows going on between them? And he intended to say, I admire Lionel Jospin in many different ways, but unfortunately in French he said, I desire Lionel Jospin in many different positions. So I'm just really conscious. Why I say this is a phenomenal achievement is not only because we all speak different languages and sometimes those lead to major misunderstandings and disagreements, but actually far more importantly because we live on a continent that has been at war not just all of a large chunk of the last century, which saw millions go to their death, but in every single century. There is no other continent in the world that has been so systematically at war. In the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century, constantly at war, and blood has been spilt because people have preferred to fight on a battlefield rather to sit round in a dull, boring meeting. And I'm in favour of dull, boring meetings. And that's why I believe in the European Union as a fundamental principle, because I stand for a very simple concept, which is that we achieve far more by our common endeavour than we can ever do on our own. I think that's true as a community, it's true as a family, it's true as a school, and it's also true as a community of nations. If you look at the major challenges that we've got to face in this country as we go forward, I'd put international terrorism right at the top of that list. Well, I want to know that if somebody flees this country when they've been planning an international terrorist attack, they get caught by the police anywhere else in Europe that they go to. They get extradited back to this country immediately so that they can face questioning, interrogation, and the full panoply of justice. And likewise, if somebody comes from France and has been trying to commit an atrocity or has done there to this country, I want them to be caught in this country and sent back. I want the police in all the countries in Europe to be cooperating, not just occasionally, but every single day of the week to keep us safe. And I fear that if we leave the European Union, we dismantle an element of that. If you think of the environment, environmental degradation, I know there are some people, many of them are members of UKIP, who simply refuse to believe in climate change. But I would say that if you want to tackle migration around the world in the years to come, the single thing you're going to have to tackle first is environmental degradation and climate change, because if the waters rise, because the temperature of the water has risen and the ice cap melts, you will see the first people that have to move are the poorest people living in the coastal regions of the world. They'll lose their drinking water and then they'll lose their homes. If we want to tackle environmental degradation and climate change, we have to cooperate. We have to abide by rules within the European Union. Even if we want to tackle the quality of air in our cities and across the whole of the United Kingdom, we can only do so if we've managed to persuade the French, the Germans, the Dutch, and the Poles to abide by environmental standards.
And likewise, I think we need to face up to the international challenges of countries like Russia under the heel of Putin. Putin's favourite game is to pick us off one by one in Europe, to say, no, you can't have any gas in Poland. No, you've got to pay more in other countries on the eastern bloc of the European Union. And to then go to the big countries like France and Germany and try to persuade us to do more trade with them. It's only if we stand together that we stand a chance of preventing further encroachment by Putin. And I would say the only way we can possibly tackle the problem of Chinese dumping of steel is if we are united in Europe and standing up to the power of the big market there in China. And I would say, I know they'll probably hear quite a bit about migration. There's been a lot in the debate so far, but I would just say, the first palace that was built in Westminster, where Parliament sit, was built by King Canute, who was Danish. The second was built by William the Rufus, who was the son of William the Conqueror. The clue is in the title. The royal family's blood is full of Greek, Danish, German, Dutch, Spanish, French, all sorts of different kind of blood. The Recklesses, as I understand, come from France originally. I have no idea where the Bryants came from. But frankly, we are a country of migrants, and we should be proud of it. Because I don't want to live in a Tupperware country, which is hermetically sealed, just closed in on ourselves. That way you fester, you die as a country. And I think we should take the real patriotic route, which is to say we want to expand our sphere of influence. We want to win battles in Europe. We want to go out and trade on a daily basis, not just with the countries in the world that speak English, like Australia and New Zealand and Canada, but with the biggest market that is on our doorstep. And I don't want us to lose that absolutely important sense of our own influence and ability to win battles in Europe. But when was it that we became such cowardly people as a country that we thought that we wouldn't be able to win Europe to our side of the argument? Bethany quite rightly said, and incidentally, isn't it a bit shocking that there's only one woman on the panel at all today? But as Bethany quite rightly said, we have to be a country that cooperates with other countries if we're to survive and to prosper. So mine is an entirely positive message. You're about to hear that the American president has said that we should stay in the European Union. Yes, it just so happens that every single international leader in the world has said that we should leave, apart from Donald Trump. Don't vote with Trump. Vote for British patriotism. Vote to stay in the European Union.
Good afternoon. Chris started by telling you about Tony Blair's visit to the National Assemblée in France and what he said. At the time, he had a great problem with the left of his party. He thought he'd abandoned socialism. So he started off his speech to that assembly by telling them he once worked as a barman in France. And it wasn't a wholly positive experience because he was told that what you had to do is when you were given tips, there was a bottle on the bar, and sort of everyone put their sort of tips in there, and then it was shared afterwards. So he obediently sort of did that and started doing so, until after a few weeks he discovered actually that wasn't the case. He was the only person sort of doing that, and everyone else kept their tips. He then said that was his first experience of socialism, which I thought was a slightly controversial thing for a Labour Prime Minister to have said at that time. I apologise to everyone here, and particularly to our chairman, for having been late. Before I was elected to the Assembly in Cardiff, I was told that it wasn't always terribly exciting, and what we did there would never be covered by the UK media. So we're trying to change that. I want to speak to you today about three things about the European Union. I want to speak to you about power, I want to speak to you about trade, and I want to speak to you about money. The last time I did one of these debates, I was up against a Labour MP from Blaenau Gwent near here, called Alan Davis. When he went to visit the MEPs in Brussels, he, I'm told, said to them that we had to stay in Europe because we couldn't make laws for ourselves. And when asked why, he said it's because we didn't have the expertise. Whether in Wales, whether in the UK, what the Remain side are really saying is that we're better off as a country if we allow a qualified majority of other countries to make our laws for us. They made some arguments about influence. They said that, supposedly we weren't outvoted or we made a great difference. Let me share with you one fact. Since Tony Blair was elected in 1997, there have been 72 occasions on which this country has voted against an EU measure in the Council of Ministers. Now, do you know how many times we have succeeded out of those 72 in blocking those measures? The answer is 0. 72 times we have voted against a measure we didn't want in this country, in that EU Council of Ministers, and every single time over the past 20 years, we have lost that vote. Now, you have a vote for the European Parliament. Not too many people turn out to vote because they don't feel that it makes a great deal of difference. And one reason it doesn't make a great deal of difference, because unlike any democracy in the world, the European Union doesn't allow its MEPs to put forward laws. That is something that is only being able to do by the unelected Commission. They have a monopoly on commencing legislation. Only the unelected commissioners, not MEPs who are elected, are allowed to propose legislation. I do not believe that we are better governed by 27 or 28 other countries making votes, making our laws, whether it's 50%, whether it's 80%, estimates varies. I believe that we are better off in making laws ourselves, because if you don't like what I'm doing in the Assembly, if you don't like what Chris is doing at Westminster, ultimately you get the chance to vote those people out. In the European Union, it is not possible, because it is the Commission that proposes the legislation, irrespective of who you vote in as MEPs. And frankly, whoever you vote for in Cardiff, whoever you vote for in Westminster, the majority of the legislation that affects your lives is determined not by them, but by the European Union. Now, the reason they try and do this, the way it's sold in this country, is as if it's some sort of economic organisation, as if it's about trade. Actually, if you cross the channel, very few people talk about that as if it's the main thing to do about the EU. I think Chris Briant and two of the other speakers made, I think, very honest arguments. They put the focus that, the EU is about avoiding war. Well, I would suggest to you that that is a 1950s solution to a 1940s problem. Time has moved on. The countries of Europe are not about to go to war and have a conflagration that we saw in the Second World War. Those times are thankfully behind us, and they are behind us irrespective of whether we freely and democratically make decisions here or whether we continue to allow the European Union undemocratically to make decisions for us on which 72 times our government has voted against that decision and 72 times it has been outvoted. At the moment, we have free trade with the European Union. We have a common system of regulation. It used to be about mutual recognition. There was a case called Cassis de Dijon, and it said that there would be recognition. If you met the standard in one EU country, then you could sell into another country. But that has all changed. And instead, what they try and do is to have a single regulation, which isn't about free trade or a free market. It just bans people from selling anything unless it complies with a single standard that is set by politicians and bureaucrats at the centre who say you're unable to trade or produce anything unless it conforms to the standards we determine. We believe in markets. We believe in regulation where it is appropriate, that is suited to our national needs and not applied across the whole European Union. Yes, when we sell to the European Union, of course we have to meet their standards, just as we do when we sell to the United States or to Japan. But we don't need to apply those standards to our exports elsewhere, and we don't need to apply that to by far the largest amount of our economy, which is domestic. That costs an awful lot of money for business. It reduces wages below what they would otherwise be, and it doesn't give us the free access to the fast-growing markets of the world. We're tying ourselves to the one declining continent in a customs union. Its share of world trade goes down all the time. We want a free trade deal with the United States. For 40, 50 years, the EU hasn't done it. I don't believe it's going to. It's inconceivable that the UK wouldn't have a trade deal by now if we had stayed out the EU with the United States. And if we leave the European Union, we will be their largest market. They sell more to us than they do to the United States and Japan put together. When we are already compliant with the regulations, when we already have free trade, the idea there's going to be a trade war, they'll suddenly erect tariffs against us, is, I think, absolutely preposterous. The Germans will want to sell their cars to us as much then as they do now. They sell £67 billion more to us than we do to them. And the money we pay into the European Union, £350 million a week, enough for a new hospital every week, enough to pay our education budget. Yes, we get some of it back, but they spend it on what they want to spend it on rather than what we want to spend it on. Even in the worst case scenario, that we're in WTO rules and there was a common external tariff against us, the cost of that tariff to our exporters would be barely a third of the amount of money we pay to the European Union every year. So I say, instead of allowing 27 other countries to make our laws for us, instead of paying them 350 million weeks for the privilege of their governing us, I say let's once again be a normal independent country where we trade with Europe, where we govern ourselves, and where we're once again more than a star on somebody else's flag.
All that remains for me to say is thank you all for coming. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for lending your ears, and I hope the debate has helped your decision for the 23rd of June.